The judge laughed at a 12-year-old black girl right in the courtroom. He didn't realize her IQ was 190. Subscribe to the channel. What city are you from? Write in the comments. The morning began like any other in the modest house at the edge of Sycamore Street. A low sun filtered through the thin curtains, brushing the pale yellow walls with a golden tint. In the kitchen, the scent of toast and scrambled eggs lingered in the air, though neither mother nor daughter sat down to eat. Ella Thompson moved with quiet urgency, folding her uniform, brushing invisible lint from her apron, smoothing her tightly pulled hair. Her daughter, Iris, sat at the table, her small frame bent over a thick, worn legal textbook, tracing a line of text with one finger as she silently mouthed each word. The house was still, yet a strange heaviness hung in the air, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Ella glanced at the clock, then at her daughter. "You'll be late for the library, baby." "I've already read everything on the third floor," Iris replied without looking up. Ella smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her daughter was 12, but she spoke with the calm precision of someone decades older. It had been that way for as long as Ella could remember. While other children were watching cartoons, Iris was reading legal casebooks referencing obscure judicial decisions with startling clarity. She wasn't precocious in the loud, attention-seeking way. Her intelligence was quiet, unrelenting, a mind like a blade honed in silence. "You don't have to read everything in one lifetime," Ella said softly, reaching over to smooth a curl that had escaped Iris's headband. "I'm not trying to read everything," Iris answered. "Just enough to make them listen." Ella paused, the smile fading. She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. Outside, the rumble of an engine broke the morning calm. A black car with tinted windows rolled to a slow stop just beyond their gate. Iris looked up. Her expression didn't change, but Ella froze. Two uniformed officers stepped out, adjusting their belts, their hands already resting near their holsters, as if the act of walking required vigilance. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, approached the front door. He knocked once, hard enough to rattle the frame. "Ella Thompson?" he called. Ella stood slowly, smoothing her apron as if that could prepare her for what came next. She opened the door. "Yes?" The officer pulled a paper from a folder and read from it, voice flat and rehearsed. "You are under arrest for the suspected theft of property valued at over $50,000 belonging to Gerald Croft, your employer. You have the right to remain silent." "What?" Ella whispered. This is a mistake. I didn't—" "You can explain that at the station," the second officer interrupted, already pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Iris stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, watching as her mother was restrained like a criminal. No one had asked a question. No one had hesitated. It was as if the charge itself had already proven guilt. "Wait," Iris called, her voice slicing through the morning air. "Where's the evidence? You can't arrest someone without—" "She'll get her chance in court," the officer snapped. "You're her daughter, right? You stay here." They led Ella to the car without further explanation. The neighbors peeked from their windows, some in curiosity, some with barely concealed satisfaction. A black woman being arrested wasn't a rare sight. Just another whisper to be added to the rustling leaves of suburban gossip. Iris didn't cry. She stood at the gate long after the car disappeared from view, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't cry when she went back into the house, nor when she gathered every document her mother had ever filed. She only cried when she saw the newspaper the next morning, where a grainy photo of Ella in handcuffs was printed beneath the headline, "Maid steals millions in jewels from family she served." No name, no presumption of innocence, no question marks. That afternoon, she sat across from the court-appointed attorney, a man who looked more interested in his coffee than in the folder he lazily thumbed through. "Honestly, kid, it's not a strong case," he said with a sigh. "I've seen worse, but your mom's got motive, opportunity, and no alibi. The best we can hope for is a plea deal. If she confesses—" "She's not confessing," Iris said flatly. The man raised an eyebrow. "That's not your decision." "She didn't do it," Iris said, "and I can prove it." The attorney chuckled without humor. "You're 12. You can't even legally represent yourself in a school debate. And your mom can't afford a private lawyer, let alone a trial. This is reality, not a TV show." Iris stood. She gathered the papers back into her folder with precise care. "Then I'll do it myself." He smirked. "Good luck with that." That night, Iris wrote a formal petition to the court. She referenced Article 12 of the state constitution, provisions of family representation, and historical precedents where minors were permitted to speak in court under exceptional circumstances. She compiled affidavits from neighbors attesting to her mother's integrity, listed inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline, and submitted her request to the courthouse the following morning. 3 days later, the court responded. She was granted a preliminary hearing to argue for the right to represent her mother. The judge assigned to the case was none other than Justice Thomas B. Barkley, a man notorious for his rigidity and biting tongue. He had been on the bench longer than Iris had been alive and was known to dismiss even seasoned lawyers with a wave of his gavel. Word spread quickly. A child defending a criminal case? It became a local spectacle. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as Iris arrived in a simple navy dress, her braids pulled back neatly, her documents tucked under her arm. Inside the courtroom, people whispered and snickered. Some looked at her with fascination, others with amusement, a few with contempt. At the defense table, Iris sat alone. No one offered to help her. Even the court bailiff looked unsure of how to treat her, child or attorney, joke or threat. The prosecutor, a man named Albert Crane, adjusted his cufflinks and leaned over to whisper to a reporter. "This should be entertaining. Maybe she'll recite the Pledge of Allegiance for us." Judge Barkley entered the courtroom with his usual air of impatient authority. He scanned the room, pausing when his eyes landed on Iris. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Iris Thompson, Your Honor," she said calmly, rising. "I've filed a motion to represent my mother in court." "You're 12, he said flatly. "Yes, sir." "This is not a spelling bee," he added, and some people laughed. "I'm aware," she replied. He narrowed his eyes, flipping through the motion on his desk. "This is well written," he admitted grudgingly. "Too well written for a child. I wrote it." "We'll see about that," he muttered. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. Then, with a smirk, he said, "Let's make this simple. Before I entertain this circus, you'll prove your qualifications, right here, right now. Consider it your entrance exam." Iris nodded. "I accept." Crane smiled broadly. He thought the game had begun. What none of them understood, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the spectators with their cameras and quiet sneers, was that for Iris, the game had started the moment they had dragged her mother away. As the bailiff called the court to order, Iris stood with her hands clasped behind her back, eyes locked on the judge's face. Not defiant, not afraid, simply ready. The courtroom would never be the same again. When the gavel struck the wood and echoed through the courtroom, the murmurs fell silent like a wave retreating from the shore. The bailiff barked the formalities with mechanical cadence, and all rose as Judge Barkley took his seat. He didn't bother to hide his skepticism as he adjusted his robe and looked out over the courtroom, his gaze landing squarely on Iris. She stood beside the defense table, composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her chair remained empty. She had chosen to stand. There was a quiet, measured defiance in that choice, not childish bravado, but something more deliberate, like a queen refusing to kneel. The room was packed. Reporters lined the back row, phones ready, pens dancing over notepads. The gallery was filled with curious locals, courthouse regulars, and a few former defendants eager to see the famous Barkley handle what they assumed would be a brief, entertaining dismissal. Somewhere in the back, a pair of young boys snickered and whispered. To them, this was spectacle, a child playing lawyer. To Iris, it was war. Judge Barkley cleared his throat and folded his hands over the bench. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice slow, deliberate, almost patronizing. "This court granted you the privilege of presenting an argument to establish your qualifications to act in defense of your mother. Do you understand the weight of that responsibility?" "Yes, Your Honor," Iris answered, her tone even, respectful. "I hope you do," he replied, "because you're standing in a courtroom, not a classroom debate. If I find that you're wasting this court's time, I will end this charade myself." Iris nodded, unwavering. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Crane, any objections before we proceed?" Crane leaned forward with a smirk. "Only that I expect this to be a short performance, Your Honor. But I'm curious. Let's see how deep the rabbit hole goes." There was a ripple of laughter from the audience, subdued but unmistakably mocking. Iris's eyes remained fixed on the judge. "Very well," Barkley said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's begin with something simple." He paused, tapping a finger against the edge of the bench. Then, as if on cue, his expression changed, becoming sly and theatrical, the kind of look that signaled he had set a trap. "Tell me, Miss Thompson," he said, "is the sky blue?" There were chuckles around the room, light, amused, condescending. Crane allowed himself a laugh. Even the stenographer raised her brows. Iris didn't blink. "No, Your Honor," she said calmly. The room stilled. Barkley raised an eyebrow. "No? The perception of the sky as blue is a result of Rayleigh scattering, a phenomenon in which shorter blue wavelengths of sunlight scatter in the atmosphere more than other colors," she said. "However, the sky itself has no intrinsic color. Its appearance varies depending on conditions such as atmospheric composition, time of day, weather, and environmental factors. Therefore, categorizing the sky as blue is observationally common, but not universally or scientifically accurate." For a moment, the judge simply stared. The laughter had stopped. "Interesting," he muttered. "Let's continue. A person who confesses to a crime is guilty. True or false?" "False," Iris replied. He gave a tight smile. "Explain." "Confessions can be influenced by coercion, psychological pressure, fear, ignorance of rights, or even exhaustion. The phenomenon of false confessions is well documented," she said. "In the case of State versus Henderson, for instance, a man confessed after 20 hours of interrogation without food or legal counsel. DNA evidence later proved his innocence. Legally, a confession is not conclusive proof of guilt unless it is corroborated by external evidence. Thus, the statement is false, both legally and logically." Crane's expression had tightened. Barkley adjusted his glasses, leaning forward. All laws are fair. False. Another pause. Go on. Laws are written by people. People carry bias, agendas, cultural limitations. History is full of unjust laws. Segregation laws in the U.S., apartheid in South Africa, colonial ordinances that restricted native populations. Fairness is not inherent in legality. An unjust law may be legal, but that does not make it moral or equitable. As stated by St. Augustine, an unjust law is no law at all. There was no laughter now. The audience sat in heavy silence. The earlier amusement dissolved like sugar in boiling water. The game, they were beginning to realize, was not going according to plan. Judge Barkley's tone darkened, losing its performative flourish. If you do not break the law, you will never go to prison. False. Explain. Innocent people are convicted often, she said, her voice as steady as ever, due to prosecutorial misconduct, mistaken identity, poor legal defense, and systemic bias. In People v. Park, a man was imprisoned for a robbery he didn't commit, based on flawed eyewitness testimony. Later, surveillance footage exonerated him. The justice system is imperfect, and legal innocence does not guarantee protection from punishment. Crane shifted in his seat. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped stare. He looked for the first time unsure. Barkley took a slow breath. His fingers tapped the desk in thought. Laws are created for the benefit of society. False, Iris said. There was a collective breath in the room. Laws are often created to serve the interests of those in power, she continued. Historically, laws have protected slavery, excluded women from voting, criminalized peaceful protest. Even now, corporate lobbying influences legislation that benefits the few over the many. A law's existence doesn't prove its righteousness. It only proves that those in authority permitted it to exist. Barkley's jaw clenched. His next question came faster, clipped. A judge's ruling is always final. False, she replied. Judicial rulings are subject to appeal. If new evidence arises, or if misconduct is proven, higher courts may overturn lower court decisions. In Kim v. State, the Supreme Court reversed a conviction due to bias in the original trial. No ruling is beyond scrutiny. By now, the mood in the courtroom had shifted completely. The people who had arrived expecting entertainment were watching something else entirely, a dismantling, not of the law, but of their assumptions. Crane's face had paled. Barkley's fingers had stopped tapping. Minors cannot argue in court, he said, almost as if daring her. There is no statute in this state that categorically prohibits minors from representing someone in court, Iris said. In family court, minors often speak on their own behalf. In juvenile justice cases, self-representation is rare but permitted under judicial discretion. The law provides for competence, not age. Barkley opened his mouth to retort, but stopped. He had nothing left. Every line of challenge had been met, not with defiance, not with arrogance, but with precision, with truth. The silence grew. The cameras clicked. Reporters whispered furiously into their phones. Finally, Barkley sat back. Enough. His voice was sharp, but there was no force behind it. I refuse to waste this court's time any further with... Are you conceding, Your Honor? Iris asked, her tone polite but firm. There was a visible reaction in the room, a collective intake of breath. Barkley stared at her. For the first time in his long career, he had no response. Not because he was outmatched in position or power, but because he was outmatched in logic, in clarity, in preparation. And that truth settled in the room like a weight that could not be shifted. Iris didn't press the moment. She didn't smile. She simply waited. And that silence, that choice to wait, not to gloat, was what broke him. He leaned forward slowly, gripping the edge of his bench. His voice, when it came, was low and careful. "You may proceed with your defense." No applause followed. No cheer erupted. Just the stillness of something irreversible. A shift that no one could unsee. Crane stared at the judge in disbelief, then at Iris, who turned to face him now with quiet resolve. She opened the folder in front of her, pulled out the first document, and said, "Then let us begin." The courtroom settled again into silence, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation or amusement. It was something else now: unease, respect, and, in some cases, shame. The shift was almost physical, like a change in air pressure, and every person present felt it. The girl they had all underestimated had not only proven herself capable of presenting a legal defense, but she had, in a matter of minutes, dismantled the authority of the very man presiding over the trial. Judge Barkley, once immovable in his presence, now sat quieter, his gavel unused, his shoulders just slightly lower. Iris took her place at the defense table. She didn't rush. Every movement was precise and considered. She opened her binder, clipped into it page after page of notes, printed documents, photographs, highlighted testimony records. Her small hand hovered above the materials like a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra. Across from her, the prosecutor, Albert Crane, sat tensely. His expression had changed. There was no longer that smirk, that relaxed arrogance. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. He understood now that this wasn't going to be the open and shut case he had envisioned. And worse, that he had already made a mistake, underestimating a girl who didn't know how to lose. Iris turned her gaze to Judge Barkley. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to begin by reviewing the prosecution's evidence." Barkley gave a short nod. "Proceed." She selected a single sheet from her folder and held it up. "This is a scanned copy of the contract that the prosecution claims was used as the basis for my mother's alleged access to the Croft residence on the day of the theft. It contains a signature and a date, June 18th, followed by a notary stamp from a private verification agency." Crane leaned forward, preparing to object, but Iris continued before he could open his mouth. "I requested and received, through a formal records request, the operational charter of the notary agency in question. That document is dated July 1st, nearly 2 weeks after the supposed date of this contract." She walked to the front of the courtroom and placed both documents side by side on the evidence monitor. The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying the discrepancy in high resolution. A few members of the gallery leaned forward. "This means," Iris said calmly, "that the notarization could not have occurred on June 18th because the agency did not legally exist. Therefore, this document is either a forgery or it was fabricated post hoc to provide retroactive justification." Judge Barkley's brow furrowed. He adjusted his glasses and studied the screen. Crane rose slowly. This is a technicality," he said, but his voice betrayed his discomfort. "A clerical error, perhaps. The date may have been misprinted, but—" "Would you like the court to believe," Iris interjected, "that a legal document central to your case was filed through a notary that hadn't opened its doors yet, and that this was simply an error of ink?" Crane hesitated. "Mistakes happen." "Certainly," she said, nodding, "but patterns reveal intentions. This is the first of several inconsistencies." She returned to the table, retrieved a small digital storage device and offered it to the bailiff. Exhibit B. Surveillance footage from the Croft residence on the afternoon of June 18th. The prosecution submitted a clipped version showing my mother entering the house. What they failed to include were the 15 minutes preceding that, which I obtained from the security company that services the Croft estate. Judge Barkley gestured for the footage to be played. The room dimmed slightly as the screen came to life. At first, it showed only the exterior of the grand home's service entrance. Then a young man appeared, tall, pale-skinned, wearing a hoodie and jeans. He typed in the door code, looked around, and entered. "That," Iris said, her voice carrying through the quiet room, "is Thomas Croft, 19 years old, the employer's nephew. He has a record, 2 juvenile offenses, both for theft, and yet he was not listed in the witness log, nor in the prosecution's timeline." The footage continued. 10 minutes after Thomas entered, the camera showed Ella approaching the house from the garden side. She entered through the same door. Minutes later, Thomas exited the back carrying what appeared to be a duffel bag. Crane stood again, trying to salvage control. "That doesn't prove anything. He lives there." "Incorrect," Iris replied. "He stays occasionally, but his primary address is in another county. His name does not appear on the official residence registry. Furthermore, I have a statement from a former security guard, Mr. Julio Vargas, who was dismissed days after the incident. He states under oath that he saw Thomas Croft leave with that bag and that he reported it to his supervisor. That report mysteriously vanished." She handed a signed affidavit to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Barkley read it carefully. His jaw tightened. "Additionally," Iris continued, "the supposed item stolen, a diamond necklace valued at $52,000, was insured only weeks prior to the alleged theft, despite having been in the family's possession for years. Why reinsure it just before it conveniently disappears? And why file a claim so quickly, within 24 hours, before the police had even completed a preliminary report?" Crane's voice was strained now. "You're speculating." "No," Iris said. "I'm presenting a sequence of facts that suggest motive, opportunity, and alternative suspect. If this were a case against Thomas Croft, would you be as dismissive?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Crane sat down, his mouth a hard line. Iris walked slowly back to her table. "Your Honor, the prosecution has failed to provide conclusive evidence of my mother's guilt. Instead, they've offered circumstantial documentation, questionable timelines, and omitted key individuals. Worse, they have submitted at least one fabricated document to this court." She paused. "I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my mother on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct and falsified evidence." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Barkley lifted a hand for silence. Crane rose again, desperation now thinly masked as formality. "The defense is a child. This entire proceeding—" "She is a child," Barkley said, cutting him off. "But that child just exposed every crack in your foundation." He turned to Iris. "Do you have the original signature sample for comparison?" "I do," she replied. "The one allegedly forged does not match my mother's handwriting. However, it bears striking similarity to the handwriting of Thomas Croft, samples of which I obtained from school records and a prior police report." She displayed the side-by-side signatures on the monitor. The similarities were undeniable. Even from a distance, the lupin R's, the slant of the letters, they were nearly identical. Crane slumped slightly in his seat. Iris looked toward her mother, who sat in the corner, hands clasped tightly in her lap, tears silently falling down her cheeks. She had not spoken a word throughout the proceedings, but her gaze never left her daughter. In it was a quiet awe, a disbelief laced with the weight of love and sorrow. Judge Barkley took a deep breath. He looked at the documents, the screen, then finally at Iris. "This court," he said slowly, "finds substantial reason to believe that the evidence brought forth by the prosecution is unreliable, if not entirely fraudulent. The defense has presented credible arguments, logical analysis, and supported every claim with documentation. In light of this, the court is compelled to act." He paused. "The motion for dismissal is under consideration. I will take a recess before issuing my final ruling." The gavel came down with a resounding crack. The room remained frozen as Barkley stood and exited through the rear door. Crane dropped his gaze to the table, defeated. Iris closed her binder and sat for the first time that day. Her mother rushed forward, embracing her tightly. "Iris," she whispered, How did you—" "I just showed them what they refused to see," she replied softly. And as the courtroom emptied around them, as the whispers turned to headlines and the story grew beyond the courthouse walls, Iris sat in silence, her mind already moving forward. There was still one chapter left to close, one final truth to demand, and this time the entire world would be watching. When the court resumed that afternoon, a strange hush accompanied the shuffle of footsteps and rustling of papers. The spectators filed back into their seats with an unusual reverence, their voices low, almost reluctant to disturb the fragile atmosphere that had settled like a mist. For many of them, what had begun as a courtroom novelty, a child standing where seasoned lawyers did, had transformed into something they had not anticipated, a reckoning. There were no more jokes, no more winks or muffled chuckles. Iris Thompson, the 12-year-old girl with poise and precision in her every movement, had changed the shape of the room. She had pulled back the curtain, not just on the flaws of the case against her mother, but on the casual cruelty of a system that had never expected to be challenged by someone like her. Judge Barkley returned to his bench slowly, his steps less certain than before. There was no announcement, no theatrical tap of the gavel. He simply sat, adjusted his glasses, and looked out at the courtroom, his eyes landing on Iris for a long, contemplative moment. "I've reviewed the evidence," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I will deliver my ruling shortly. But before that, Miss Thompson, I will grant you the floor, should you wish to make a closing statement." Iris stood without hesitation. She gathered nothing, no notes, no papers. Her hands remained at her sides as she walked to the center of the courtroom and turned, not toward the judge, but to face everyone. She looked small, standing there, a child framed by towering oak panels and heavy burgundy drapes. But her voice, when it came, did not waver. "This case," she began, "was never just about a necklace." The silence deepened, listening, leaning forward. "It was about assumptions," she continued. "Assumptions made the moment my mother's skin color entered the room before her words did. Assumptions about where we belong, what we deserve, and what we're capable of. My mother was not just accused, she was prejudged, and I was not supposed to be able to stop that." She turned toward the jury box, though it was empty in this hearing. People saw a 12-year-old girl and thought, she must be joking, playing, pretending. But I was never pretending. I wasn't trying to be a lawyer. I was trying to be heard. Her voice remained steady, but something behind it shimmered, controlled emotion rising like steam. For generations, people who looked like me have been told to be quiet, to wait, to be patient. We are told that justice is slow, that fairness takes time. But what happens in the meantime? What happens to those who are crushed beneath the weight of that waiting? She looked at the judge now directly. My mother would have gone to prison, not because she was guilty, but because no one was supposed to question the story told by the people with money and power. No one was supposed to notice the gaps, the timing, the lies. But I noticed. I noticed because I've been paying attention since I was old enough to read the words "not guilty" and wonder why they so rarely applied to people like us. She took a breath. You asked me to prove that I had the right to stand here, that I understood what justice meant. But that was never really the question, was it? The real question was whether you were willing to listen to someone you never expected to be right. There was a rustle in the gallery, a breath, a cough, a handkerchief raised to a face. She stood unmoving, her eyes never leaving the judge. Justice isn't about age or titles, she said. It's not about robes or degrees. It's about truth, about facts, about what actually happened, not who's powerful enough to make people believe what didn't. She turned to her mother then, and for the first time the carefully controlled mask of professionalism softened. My mother didn't raise me to fight, she said. She raised me to think, to learn, to be kind. She taught me to say please and thank you, and to always tell the truth, even when it's hard, especially then. Her voice faltered for half a second, just enough to catch the breath of every person listening. I stood here today because she couldn't, because no one else would, because the truth matters, because she matters. Ella's face was streaked with silent tears. Her hands were pressed to her lips, trembling. Iris looked back to the judge. I'm finished, she said. There was no applause, no sound at all, just a stillness that felt full of meaning. Judge Barkley exhaled slowly and leaned forward. This court, he said, recognizes that the defense has presented clear and compelling evidence that the charges against Ella Thompson are unsubstantiated. Furthermore, the court acknowledges credible signs of prosecutorial negligence, possible evidence tampering, and the failure to fully investigate alternate suspects. His eyes flicked briefly to Crane, who sat frozen. In light of these findings, he continued, this court dismisses all charges against the defendant. Ella Thompson is declared not guilty. This case is closed. The gavel fell. Gasps erupted through the room, followed by a swell of whispered exclamations. Reporters leapt from their seats. Camera shutters clicked like machine guns. Crane slumped backward, defeated, while Barkley remained in his chair, his face unreadable. Iris returned to her mother, who rose unsteadily, arms open. They embraced tightly, Ella whispering through tears, You did it. You really did it. Iris closed her eyes and whispered, I promised. They stood together in the center of the courtroom as the world swirled around them, a storm of attention, questions, awe. But for a moment, it was just them. Mother and daughter, survivor and shield. Across the room, Barkley finally rose from the bench. He hesitated, then, in a move that stunned everyone, he stepped forward, stopping a few feet away from Iris. Miss Thompson, he said, his voice softer than it had ever been, you reminded us all what this courtroom is supposed to stand for. He extended a hand. Iris looked at it, then shook it. A few feet behind, a reporter whispered, She's going to change the world. Iris didn't hear. She wasn't thinking about the headlines or the microphones or the questions that would follow. Her mind was already moving forward, toward the future, toward the systems that still needed unraveling, toward the people still waiting to be heard. Outside, the press waited like a tide-gathering force. The story was no longer local. It had gone national. A child had out-argued the system and won. As Iris stepped into the sunlight, reporters surged forward. "Miss Thompson, how did you prepare? Are you planning to become a lawyer? Do you think your age helped or hurt your case?" She paused, looked into the cameras. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was the same one she had used in court. Clear, precise, unshaken. "I didn't come here to be a lawyer," she said. "I came here to make them listen." Then she took her mother's hand, and they walked down the courthouse steps together, past the cameras and the flashbulbs into the waiting world. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel.